Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a double box review. Yes, the Rafael Kubelik boxes from Eloquence. Fantastic. The Mercury Living Presence recordings from Chicago, and later the Decca recordings. Now, these performances are historically fascinating, and I want to try and look at them from a quasi-historical perspective. Kubelik was a great conductor. There's no question about that. But he didn't start out that way. And it's really important to try, if we can, to see these recordings without the virtue of hindsight, not judging them in light of what he did and what came later. That is, his triumphant, really, tenure with the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra, which was amply documented by Deutsche Grammophon in his recordings, both with that orchestra and with the Berlin Philharmonic. And we're talking about Dvorak cycles, Schumann cycles, Wagner operas, all kinds of fascinating stuff. And you can't really see his career without taking into consideration what he later achieved. But I think we need to try in order to understand the value of these early recordings. And they are valuable. They're valuable as historical documents, sonic documents, for a lot of reasons in the history of criticism, which we'll get to in a moment. So I'm going to start with the Mercury Living Presence recordings, which are almost uniformly marvelous. But here's the thing. There are some very great performances in here, some less great performances as well, but they were all considered remarkable because they were landmarks, true landmarks in the history of recorded sound. These are the mono recordings made with single microphones with the Chicago Symphony, which of course is one of the world's great orchestras, during its very turbulent 3 years with Rafael Kubelik as music director. So let's talk about first what's on these discs, and then we'll talk about how they are and what they are, essentially. You get the famous Mussorgsky-Ravel Pictures in an Exhibition, which is one 28-minute CD, a little bit skimpy in terms of filling. Then you get the Bartók music for strings, percussion, and celesta, coupled with the Block Concerto Grosso. Some very interesting repertoire, very, very well done. Dvorak's New World Symphony, something that Kubelik always did really well. Tchaikovsky's Fourth and Tchaikovsky's Sixth. The Fourth, I think, is a better performance than the Pathetique, than the Sixth. The Fourth is really a very exciting and passionate performance. The Sixth is quite good, but there were lots of great Pathetiques out there, and there still are. The Brahms Symphony No. 1, which also is good, but not in the great league, probably. Smetana's Ma Vlast, a Kubelik standard. And this was one of his great performances of it. It was his first complete recording of it, although he did bits of it earlier for EMI, of all labels. And then Mozart Symphonies 38 and 34 on another disc. They are quick and light and lively and attractive. The Hindemith Symphonic Metamorphosis and the Schoenberg 5 orchestral pieces. A very, very interesting performances, repertoire, and the performances are marvelous, absolutely splendid. And then finally, there's a 10th CD where you have an interview with Wilma Cozart-Fine, the legendary Mercury Living Presence producer. She was half of the team of Wilma Cozart-Fine and Bob Fine, the engineer, and together they created this label. And one of the wonderful things about her interview, and you'll hear this if you listen to it, is she talks about, Mercury Living Presence as a catalog, a planned catalog. And that's why it had a lot of the cachet that it did. It had its proprietary sound, it had its repertoire, it had its artists. In other words, she makes a fantastic argument for a label with a guiding intelligence behind it, something utterly missing from today's major labels. Certainly the independent labels still have that, at least to a degree. But, today we're in a different world. We really are. And then there are some experimental stereo recordings of these same things that were made by Burt White, who later went on to be the recording engineer for Everest Records And it's interesting to have, but I'm not an audiophile in that sense, so I don't particularly care because the monos sound fantastic. The Pictures in an Exhibition is possibly the most legendary of all of them. It was the recording that invented the term, the living presence of the orchestra, and gave the label its name, which is simply marvelous. Although I have to say, as a performance, I don't find that Pictures in an Exhibition to be all that remarkably compelling. It's fast and it's light and it's very good. I mean, and it features Bud Herseth on trumpet for the first of his 7 Chicago Pictures in an Exhibition recordings. I can't even begin to make the list of all of them, but there were a lot. Then there was Reiner, and there was Giulini, and there was Schulte, and there was Jarvi, and there was all kinds of a Nozawa, and I think there was another one somewhere in the middle. There was a whole pile of them, and they all featured Bud Herseth on the trumpet, which was in itself a tremendous legacy. So, this set is sui generis. And it's definitely worth having. Everyone's waiting for it. Basically, it still has all of the cachet it had when it came out, and having it together in a box with a very intelligent liner note and somewhat controversial, which we'll get to in a moment, is just splendid. But there's always a but, isn't there? These performances are as famous for their audiophile qualities, for their sonic qualities, and for the history of sound as they are for the musical performances. Kubelik's tenure in Chicago was extremely controversial, and it was extremely controversial because he had a very rocky road with the chief critic in Chicago at the time for the Chicago Tribune, Claudia Cassidy. Now, Claudia Cassidy has been reviled over the years. I mean, she was known as the wicked witch of the Midwest, and as Acidy Cassidy, and famously by some people as that bitch, largely because she was female, and there were very few female classical music critics. She was also a theater critic. She had a tremendous clout in Chicago and an enormous readership in those days when newspapers really, really mattered. But she was a splendid critic. She had her prejudices. She had her biases. She was a very entertaining writer. But her opinion of Kubelik was really very simple, and I think correct, frankly. Her view was that he was too young for Chicago, that he was just starting his career, and that Chicago itself, she was very, very, very straightforward about this, that Chicago was not America's second city, that it did not deserve anything second rate, that it should only have the best, and that to put Kubelik in charge of this orchestra, which had a tremendous history, was, she felt, settling for second best. And she wasn't prepared to do that. But the fact of the matter is that in terms of Kubelik's career, and I think his artistic maturity, she was right. If you go back and look at his programming in Chicago, and the note here is not entirely honest about it, because they talk about his programming in terms of lists. Well, he did X premieres and Y American music and Z classical standards. Yes, he did all of those things. But the question is, how did he create concert programs, one at a time, mixing those things? I've looked through all of his programming at that time. His programming was terrible. He didn't know how to put together a program. He really didn't. It may be he only made it in Germany where they would put up with such things. But for, I think, an American, subscription audience, no. Nor was he mature artistically as an interpreter, because you can compare a lot of these things with things he did later and better, including the New World Symphony, including not Pictures in an Exhibition, but Mavlost. These are fine performances. But Kubelik had himself to compare with them, and quite often he improved. He visibly improved, and we'll talk about that in the second box in a moment. But the fact of the matter is that Cassidy did not want Chicago to have anything second rate. And at this point in his career, Kubelik was a second-tier conductor. She wanted Zell. She wanted Reiner. She wanted Bruno Walter. She had her standards. And she was right to stick to them because, as it turns out, once Kubelik disappeared, who did they get? They had, after a little bit of futzing about, they got Reiner. And the golden age of the Chicago Symphony ensued. And that was also largely due to Claudia Cassidy's pressure. And she gets reviled for chasing away Kubelik and no credit whatsoever for promoting Reiner, which turned out to be absolutely the right choice. This woman knew what she was talking about in terms of concert life in those days. And I'm going to show you how she did it and prove it to you in a sense, if I can, because I have reviewed, I've written papers about her work. She's a fascinating study in the history of criticism. And I have all of the reviews that she wrote for the Chicago Tribune, including all of her reviews of Rafael Kubelik's concerts. And she is brutal. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. She did not like this guy. But she did not like this guy comparatively. She was extremely strategic in her dislike of Kubelik. And I want to read a review for you, just so you get a sense of it. I have it right here. From the Chicago Tribune of January 4th, 1952. And this is fascinating for all kinds of reasons. But let's look at the title. Reassuring or disheartening concert. It's all in point of view. That's what she says. Here's the review. She writes, point of view is a flexible matter, depending on where you stand and what you stand for. If you accept the industriously planted idea that the Chicago Symphony Orchestra is a provincial organization destined, quote, to grow and develop with its young conductor, unquote, perhaps you have a fine time in Orchestra Hall observing sprouts and buds and shoots of talent. But if you happen to remember that the orchestra is more than 60 years old, that it has cost Chicago a fortune and has repaid far more than it cost in being, quote, not just for entertainment, unquote, that it has been one of the great musical organizations of the world with unsurpassed leadership and repertory, well, you have a hard time finding the sprouts and buds and shoots for the tangle of weeds in the garden. Taking mid-season leave for Holland and 6 weeks with the Concertgebouw, Rafael Kubelik gave last night's Chicago Symphony Orchestra's audience a farewell program of Beethoven's Overture to Egmont, Mahler's First Symphony, and Sibelius's Violin Concerto, which introduced Ida Handel, a Polish violinist who anticipated her American debut with performances on English-made records. Miss Handel is slight, dark, intense, and, if this appearance is to be taken as standard, at her best when she can capitalize on a warm, sweet violin tone. She displayed neither the technique nor the style necessary to virtuoso performance, and Mr. Kubelik was no help in setting or maintaining a standard. The Sibelius orchestration holds a great deal of what is either mysterious dusk or just plain murk, depending on the performance. This time it was murk. Compared to the Beethoven, which died of harsh treatment, the Mahler had its points. Some of it was fresh and resilient, and at its best it had reminders of the lyricism once considered Mr. Kubelik's major asset, a touch of the serenity that can persuade an orchestra to open its heart and sing. But just as you rejoiced that the orchestra still can sing, Kubelik returned to his old trick of piling climax on climax, not knowing anticlimax when he hears one. Point of view? Well, either you cheer what was good as hopeful, or you remember what Bruno Walter and that orchestra did with the Mahler First 2 years ago. Myself, I am waiting for next week and Walter's return. That, my friends, is a very perspicacious and, in its way, fair review. She has her bias. She tells you what it is. She evaluates the performance. She cites useful comparisons in talking about the Mahler to Bruno Walter's Mahler First, which, as it turns out, was going to be recorded right about that time and which was, quite frankly, quite a bit superior to what Kubelik was doing at the same time, as this box will demonstrate. So she wasn't entirely wrong, and her opposition to Kubelik was principled. And that's the point. She didn't just have this, psychotic female hatred of the guy. She had her reasons, and she had evidence to back her up. And I think that's really interesting. There's no shame in saying that at this point in his career, Kubelik was not ready to take on a major orchestra. And he didn't. He didn't for many years until he finally got Bavarian Radio. He really had problems settling down and finding his niche. And that was actually in the nature of his temperament and his repertoire preferences and his talent. And you can hear that. Now let's go to box number 2, which is the complete Decca recordings, some in mono, some in stereo. You get the complete Brahms symphonies with the Vienna Philharmonic, the Dvorak Cello Concerto with Pierre Fournier, the Serenade for Strings, the Dvorak Symphonies 7 and 9. Most of these are with the Vienna Philharmonic. Some are with the Israel Philharmonic, and some with Bavarian Radio later on. The Dvorak Slavonic Dances, another Mavlost, because he did it every 15 minutes, this time in stereo. Mahler Symphony number 1, and then the Janáček Sinfonietta and Tchaikovsky Romeo and Juliet. These are in mono. And then 2 operas, the Nikolai Merry Wives of Windsor and the Weber Freischütz with Bavarian Radio, both of which are absolutely excellent and very well known. We don't have to really talk about them at this point. Finally, there's an excerpt from Les Troyens, I want to die, Je veux mourir, or something like that in French, sung by Josephine Visi with the Covent Garden Orchestra. Now, let's talk about these performances. The Brahms symphonies, they're good. They're good, solid Vienna Philharmonic performances. I think the Brahms one here is probably more exciting than the Brahms one here. They are not well recorded. These Decca, first of all, let's talk about the sound. These Decca FFRR Vienna recordings from the 50s were highly, highly variable. But more to the point, the Vienna Philharmonic in the 1950s, after recovering from the war, was not a top-notch orchestra. I don't care what anybody says. The recorded evidence shows them to be fairly grungy. They had grainy-sounding strings, badly tuned woodwinds. As often as not, they played in a very slovenly fashion. And if you compare Kubelik's performances to, for example, Erich Kleiber's performances from exactly the same period, Kleiber was 10 times the conductor Kubelik was at this point. And the evidence is how well he got the Vienna Philharmonic to play. Now, granted, some of the repertoire that Kubelik did was not Vienna Philharmonic-y, but, and Kleiber was echt Viennese, and so they were able to be more echt when they played it. But still, there's a big difference in quality of results. And I think that that's an extremely telling fact. So here we have an okay Brahms cycle, very good Dvorak Cello Concerto with Fournier. The Serenade for Strings is unkillable with the Israel Philharmonic. Dvorak Symphony 7 and 9. Now, Kubelik did lots of Dvorak symphonies. There's a New World here, which is better, visibly better, especially in the playing of the orchestra. 7 and 9, he did a 7 with EMI earlier in London, which is better than this one in Vienna. And he remade both of them, of course, with the Berlin Philharmonic later. The New World was one of the reference recordings for decades. This is not his best Dvorak, not by any stretch of the imagination. He was, at this point in his career, quite variable. And what's more, he was guest conducting all of these performances effectively. So one of the attributes of a great conductor is their ability to bend an orchestra to their will and get them to surpass themselves technically. And Kubelik wasn't really able to do it in these performances. Just couldn't do it. They're not terrible, but not as good as he later got. Then we have the Slavonic dances. These are awful. The playing is just miserable. And Kubelik, his Bavarian Radio Slavonic dances are wonderful. Again, one of the reference versions in those pieces. Fast and exciting. So are these. Very hard driven, but very badly played. Oh my God, they're a mess. You can check out my review of them on classicstoday.com. Boy, they suck. It's really astonishing. The Mavlost has its points. Kubelik was always on top of Mavlost, and he always made the orchestra play. It has the most exciting sharka, probably, probably you've ever heard. And Sharka's exciting. It's about an Amazon warrior priestess who kills everybody. It's just so much fun. And this is a real smoker of a performance. But again, Kubelik's best Muflast was the Boston one on Deutsche Grammophon, and then some people prefer his Return to Prague one that was recorded on Denon, and then there was originally Denon anyway, and then there is, of course, this one from just a few years before, which set new standards in audio fidelity, even though this one is in stereo. And then the Mahler one. Mahler one is just bad. It's just bad. It is a murky, shallow, indifferent sounding performance. And I just, we have Kubelik's later Mahler 1 with Bavarian Radio, which is, one of the all-time reference recording Mahler 1s. It's fantastic. This isn't even close. He still had a ways to go as an interpreter. And again, coming in as a guest conductor, and especially in Vienna playing Mahler, which they supposedly hated at the time, he doesn't deliver the goods. The Janáček Sinfonietta and Tchaikovsky Romeo and Juliet, these are fun. These are rather dry, airless, extremely close recordings. The fanfares in the Janáček, the trumpets are like right there in front of you. But these are exciting performances, quite similar to what he did later, in Janáček anyway, which are better recorded. And the Tchaikovsky Romeo and Juliet is just fun. It's quick and passionate and hard-driven and just enjoyable. I had fun with it. Then the two operas, as I mentioned, are both excellent, and we don't have to get into the details of those. The Freischütz is particularly enjoyable because the Wolf's Glen scene has all kinds of added sound effects and percussion, including a tam-tam, which, what could be bad? When in doubt, add a tam-tam. It only improves things. But seriously, you have to be serious. We see here, I think, this is telling evidence that Claudia Cassidy was right, that Kubelik was not ready for prime time in terms of his conductorship of a major orchestra. I think he still had a ways to go developing as an artist. You can hear him beginning to develop, in some of the better performances on these things. But these sets are also telling evidence of just how important sonics and intelligent repertoire planning and catalog guidance and A&R are in creating the mystique, the legend that is a conductor or an artist's career, a musician's career. Fascinating. Why are these recordings outstanding and fabulous while these recordings are such a mixed bag? Because of I would argue, because of the artistic intelligence and sensitive planning behind the making of the recordings themselves. But they do reveal, I think, some fascinating aspects of the artistry of Rafael Kubelik, the history of music criticism, the truth about what went on in Chicago. There's so much here that's resonant that you can sink your teeth into while enjoying these performances, even the ones that are not so good. Usually I always say that the only thing that matters is the sound of the performance, and good is good and bad is bad and who cares and blah, 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 right? We all do that. But here, there is a real reason for listening to the not so good ones and comparing them to the better ones, including Kubelik's later work on DG and some of the duplication you find in the Icon box, which is available on EMI, that has some of his other recordings of some of the same repertoire. We're lucky that we have the ability to make these comparisons and to, I think, conceptualize and focus in on the truth of Kubelik's artistic development and his career as a conductor, one that only gradually emerged. And so I think it's important not to just say Kubelik was a great conductor, everything he did was great, therefore we should listen to everything, it's all equally fabulous, it's all equally important. No, it isn't. It isn't. But it is interesting, and it's a study. I don't know if you feel like a study or if you feel like just listening for your own pleasure. That is up to you to decide. But splendidly and happily, these are available so we can make up our minds and enjoy the process. I did enormously, as I hope you can guess, and I'm sure that you will too. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me. Take care.